Hello and welcome to Hans Wargaming. In my last crafting video, I built a one-story medieval cottage, and in this video we're going to make a two-story version of that with a playable interior. I wanted to make a pretty tall foundation for this house. For that, I used some scraps of 1-inch thick foam insulation. I cut a 45-degree angle on one side, and then on the other side I left a recessed area where I'm going to add some steps. I do use reference pictures, but I try not to plan these builds out too far ahead of time. I just think it's more fun to figure it out as you go. Just like with the previous build, I'm using pre-textured dowels for this project. These are made out of scrap wood that I cut down and textured with a coarse rasp. They're about 6 by 6 millimeters wide. You can also buy these at most hardware stores if that's easier for you, but you are still going to have to texture them. I also cut out some foam bricks off camera. I used a Proxxon hot wire cutter to cut these out. Then I tumbled them with some rocks in a tin can. We're going to spread these out around the perimeter of the foundation. I think you're better off using hot glue for this part. I tried using hot glue for the first 2 layers of bricks and then wood glue for the layers above that. There's kind of pros and cons to using each one. Hot glue is a lot more messy and you have a chance of melting the foam, but wood glue doesn't set as quickly. So you'll notice that I'm assembling this on a glass cutting board, and that's because I know that it's perfectly flat, and that's one thing that I would definitely suggest when you're building something like this. Make sure that you're assembling it on a perfectly flat surface. It helps ensure the floors fit together in the end. So here you can see I'm building out the steps. I cut some really thin pieces of foam out. I'm going to use these as toppers for each step. I did texture those with some tin foil. This is how I did the angled section. Notice how on most of the corners the timbers aren't even touching the foam core. I opted to pre-paint my foundation, starting with a really dark gray base coat, making sure to avoid painting over the wooden beams. Then I dry brushed some lighter gray over top of that, and went over that with some even lighter gray. Next, I went in with some beige paint and picked out a few stones. I did 2 different tones of that, let the whole thing dry, and then went over it with some grout. So when you're applying grout like this, you can either put the grout on first, then spray it with water, or you can spray it with some water first, then put the grout on. It really doesn't matter, but I think I prefer to put the grout on first. That way I can really work it in, and then just spritz it with some water, and wipe off the surface layer with a paper towel. I'm still trying to avoid the wooden beams here, but it's not as important as it is with the paint, because this blends in with the color of the wood a little better. By the way, if you are using grout, make sure you wear a respirator. I let that cure for at least an hour, then I cover the whole thing with Mod Podge, again trying to avoid the wooden supports. Next I cut out some pieces for the bottom plate for the first floor. If I know the end's going to be exposed, I like to make sure that the cut looks fairly rough, and one way to do that is to use a saw with larger teeth, but you can also use a rasp. After going around the perimeter with my base plates, I started laying some floorboards down. To do this, I cut a bunch of stir sticks down to length, stretching from one side to the other side. I spread out some wood glue on the foundation and I started laying the boards down. I made a cut on most of them in random spots, usually kind of around like 2/3 of the way in between the board. I think having some breaks in the floorboards gives it a much more realistic look, and it's really not that much harder to do. When you get to the last piece, you kind of have to make a decision. Are you going to be able to fit another board in, or are you going to have to spread out the other boards? And one of the nice things about working with wood glue is that it gives you a lot more working time. Wood glue dries in about 10 to 15 minutes. It really depends what you're trying to bond together. Sometimes it's longer, sometimes it's shorter. If it's wood to wood, it tends to bond pretty quick. For the walls, I used foam poster board. This is 2 1/16 inch high, and similar to the foundation, I cut out a few dowels to sit at each corner. So foam board has a layer of paper on both sides, and it's nice when you're making walls like this. You can just make a shallow 90-degree cut, cutting through the paper on one side and then using the other side as a hinge. When you bend that around a corner, it leaves a nice open spot for a corner post. If you're trying to wrap this around the entire building, it can be a little tricky. So I broke my wall section into a couple different pieces. Again, I'm using wood glue to join all this together. It gives you a lot more working time and it's just a lot cleaner to work with. Here you can see I'm using a scrap 2x4 to hold it down while it dries. Throughout this build, I was also constantly going in with a wet brush and cleaning up any excess glue. For the 45-degree wall section, I cut out a V shape on either side of the foam board. Then I could just slot it into place from the top. Next, I cut out the top plates. Some of these are going to extend past the wall. We're going to do a fair amount of jettying on this building, which just means the joists are going to stick out past the first floor a little bit to support the second floor above it. I like to take a little 45-degree cut off of the ends of these. I just think it gives them a cleaner look. Here I am using a piece of scrap wood to weigh everything down again. It's nice to have something fairly heavy and flat nearby to make sure that everything is sitting and drying nice and level. Once I had all the pieces assembled, I laid my glass cutting board over top of this thing and made any final tweaks that needed to be made. I bought a couple of these Lego windows. Devs and Dice uses these a lot for his builds. They're really nice pre-made windows and they're actually pretty cheap. If you're building a few of these houses, I would definitely suggest picking a few up. All you really have to do is snip off the little Lego nub at the top. If you don't want to go the Lego route, I'll show you another way to make a window like this later. There's not really an exact science to how to detail these walls. You can get pretty creative with it, but my process consists of just covering the entire wall with wood glue, then laying in some wooden moldings, cutting out some windows where I think they would look good. Once everything's in place, I go in with a brush and stipple the wall to clean up the glue. For this one, I was sprinkling a little grout on top of that to give it a little texture. This is a totally optional step. You do not have to do this. You could also use texture paste or sand. Next, I started on the second floor. So for this build, each floor is going to be removable. To set that up, all you really need to do is cut out some pieces to sit around the inner perimeter of the wall and glue those to the underside of the second floor. To do this, it helps to have some windows cut out already. Otherwise, it's going to kind of be hard to get your fingers in there. But in the end, it's going to look something like this. And it should socket together nice and snugly. For assembly of the second floor, the process is pretty much the same. I did do the bottom plate a little bit differently. I only used a 6x6 dowel for the sections where I knew the end of the dowel was going to be visible. For any pieces where the ends weren't going to be visible, I just used molding. Once that perimeter was in place, I put down some floorboards using the same technique as before. And I do wish I would have primed this black first. It just kind of helps to hide any gaps. Now my big mistake here was that I did not weigh this down while it dried. I thought the tension would hold it together, but it did not. And one of the sides bowed up a little bit while the glue dried. If I had weighed this down, I don't think it would have been a problem. I tried using some canned vegetables to weigh that down as I was assembling the wall, but it still was kind of bowing up a little bit, so I ended up having to go in with some hot glue and just hot gluing that section down until everything else was done. And once the rest of the frame was good and dry, that held it in place and it didn't bow up anymore. As a bonus, the cans also help hold the wall in place. I cut out this nice wraparound for the top plate. Pretty proud of that. Onto the roof. On my last build, I started using these paper clamps to help support the frame as I piece it together. I think that works really well. You could do this without clamps, but it's going to be a lot harder. The actual shape of the roof was something that I had been thinking about for the entire build. I start with the rafters on each side and get the main ridge board in place. Then I can use that as a guide for the rest of the rafters. The paper clamps are invaluable here. They really help to hold everything together and keep everything in place. I wanted the rafters to hang out over top of the top plate a little bit. I had to get a little creative figuring out a way to hold them in place while they dried, and this is what I came up with. I made a hook with 2 dowels and a clamp and hung them over the ridge board. Once that was in place, I could start laying down my purlins, which is apparently what these are called. I like to put a lot of these on because they add a lot of structure and support to the roof. On the far side, I built up a secondary A-frame. The ridge beam sits a little lower than the main one on this one. It took me a while to figure out how I wanted to do the roof section for this part. I ended up extending that down from the main A-frame. I had to keep the pitch pretty low in that section because it would have been higher than the main A-frame on the end there. I think it worked out pretty well. This is a section from a thick cardboard roll. I cut 2 of those out and installed those on both flat sides of the main A-frame. Next, I got to work on my chimney. Since the roof and the second floor are removable, you almost have to do 3 different sections. I made a separate chimney section for each floor and the roof, and I did my best to line them up. For the first and second floor, I used a foam board core, just wrapping bricks around that. For the roof, I used a spare piece of hardboard for the core. That's to give it a little bit more strength. I cut a section of purlins out for the chimney to extend through, then cut a few bricks off of one side so the chimney would fit. I had a little bit of an issue lining the top of the chimney up with the bottom of the chimney. To get those to line up, I had to make what's called a witch's crook. This is something that is actually done in the real world. There's actually some fun folklore around this. I guess it was believed that witches could only fly in a straight line, and just putting a bend in your chimney would prevent them from getting down it. Okay, let's talk about that window from earlier. To do this, all you really have to do is cut out a section of this mesh plastic that will fit roughly in the window frame. And then for the moldings, I split a stir stick in half with a scissors and just cut sections off of that. You can use super glue for this part, but I would caution against using super glue for this project in general, because super glue will melt that foam that we're using for the walls. I found this out the hard way, and now I'm letting you know. If you're just bonding wood together, it's perfectly safe. Use it sparsely and try and avoid any of the foam areas. Next, I built a door, again out of stir sticks. I made the handle out of a small section of paperclip. Looking good. I also whittled some hinges down from some stir sticks. Put those on the back. I decided to do a rounded door for the other house I'm working on. Oh, did I not mention I'm working on 2 houses? I wanted to make a little cross-shaped frame for the round windows on the A-frames. I notched out a section on each one and just joined them together. I really love the look of these round windows. I don't know what exactly it is about it, but I think it's just one of those things that really elevates the look of the building overall. All right, we're getting there. Time to do some shingles. This is a way to do batch shingles. All I did for this was I cut out a shallow channel on a 2x4. It's just wide enough and deep enough that I can fit this comb in here and it'll hold it in place. And then I can use the comb as a guide. It allows you to cut multiple shingles at once. I bend every other shingle to separate the odds and the evens. That's just to make it a little bit easier to cut them down. And then I go in with the scissors and I'll just kind of trim them randomly. You do need a lot of these to do a roof. I had to do 3 or 4 batches of these. I just glued them down with some wood glue. I also added this little mini roof off camera. That's going to help keep the rainwater off of this entryway. Next, I masked off the roof and gave it a slate gray base coat. I missed a spot here, but that's okay. At this point, I base coated all of the walls in timbers with some watered down burnt umber ink. One thing that I really regret doing here is gluing the shingles on printed side down. It was really hard to cover this up and I ended up having to just paint over the entire underside of that roof. Fortunately, it's hardly ever going to be visible on camera, but for future builds, I'm going to be gluing those on printed side up. Next, I went in with a dark brown wash and once again went over all of the walls and timbers, trying to avoid all the stonework and the shingles. This is what that looks like. I know it doesn't look that great, but it's really going to come together here once we do this next step. It's almost magical. After everything's good and dry, just go in with some beige paint and dry brush the timbers. It helps to have a nice big flat brush for this. I opted to dry brush the window panes as well with that. I think this gives the timbers a really convincing aged look. For the actual frame, I dry brushed going with the grain, but for the floorboards, I used a circular motion. Here's a before and after. Next comes the most tedious part of this build, and that's blocking in all of the wattle and daub panels. I start with a base coat of wood glue mixed with white paint and just a little bit of orange paint. Then I carefully block in the color on each panel. It helps to have a really fine brush for this to get into any of the tight spots. If you do get any on the wooden panels, it's really easy to fix later on. Then I go in with some khaki paint and I wet blend that into the edges around each panel. Here's a side-by-side at this step with the previous house that I built. I went in more heavily with the khaki paint on this build and I think it looks better. But after that I did go in with some white paint and just wet blended that into the center of each panel to give each wattle and daub panel a nice radial gradient. So originally I was going to do the inside walls the same way, but I actually ended up really liking the visual texture that I had gotten with the burnt umber ink and the black wash, and I decided to try and stain it instead of just painting over it. For that I used a radiant orange dip. I think it gives it an interesting look. Again, I wasn't really planning on doing this to these walls, so if I had known that I was going to be doing it, I probably would have been a little bit more intentional with how I was doing the wash. Just something to keep in mind for future builds. I also decided to try this staining on the entire other house that I'm building, and here's what that looks like. I don't think it looks bad. Maybe if this is the style you're going for, you might want to try this out, maybe with a different color, I don't know. But for me personally, I didn't think the houses really looked that good together, so I ended up just painting this house the same way with the white paint on the panels. At that point, I cleaned up the timbers with some burnt umber ink. Now it's really coming together. With everything else finished, it was time to work on the roof. The cap piece that I put on originally wasn't really sturdy enough, so I decided to tear that off and redo it. I added another layer of shingles on both sides, and then I cut out 2 new cap pieces and doubled them up. Then I just had to base coat them again. With the walls done, I glued the fireplace in. I was still figuring out my shingles painting process in this video, so my process for this might change in the future, but this is how I did it for these 2 houses. I started with some bright blue craft paint, and I dry brushed that on in upward motions with a big flat brush. Then I mixed a bit of white paint with that and dry brushed again, same way. Then I went over the roof with that dark brown wash that we used earlier. Then I mixed up a much lighter slate blue and I dry brushed that on as well. This time I was using circular motions with a stiff bristled brush, really trying to catch all of the edges and blend that into each shingle. Then again I mixed some white with that to get a lighter version and again dry brushed the same way, a little less aggressively this time. I'm pretty proud of this build, and I had a lot of fun making it. Sure, you can poop this stuff out on a 3D printer, but crafting it is just so much more satisfying. The removable floors are going to allow me to use this for games where building interiors are much more integral to the game. I might even make a removable foundation for the second floor to sit on. That would give me 2 first floor interiors, which would be useful for certain games. Here's the other house I built, using the same techniques. I'm planning on adding to this set over time, so be on the lookout for that. For this house, I did lay the shingles on printed side up, and I can confirm that that was much easier to paint. Hopefully you got some inspiration from this build. So this channel takes a lot of time and effort to maintain. I probably put 60+ hours into this video, and YouTube doesn't exactly pay me well to do this. So if you like what I'm doing here and you want to see more, please check out the Hans Wargaming Patreon. You'll get access to my Discord community, where I post regular updates on the various projects I'm working on. You get access to ad-free videos, oftentimes early access, and you get your name in the credits like these fine folks here. Thank you to my patrons for the support. That's it for now. Thank you for watching. I hope you have a good day, and I will see you later.